So let's turn now to discourse communities, right? So Swales identifies different ways of thinking through discourse communities, um, and the primary the primary ways that he sort of distinguishes them are local, focal, and what he calls faux local discourse communities. And within local, there are several kind of subcategories: so residential, vocational, professional. Uh, so residential might be, if we're talking about here's a good example. I live in a condo. I live in a condo community. Each unit has like six condos connected. There's like 12 condo individual units. We have condo board meetings. We have an email listserv, et cetera, et cetera. This is a residential local discourse community. It's based around where one lives, right? Your neighbor, and for others, it might be your neighborhood, et cetera. Vocational might be maybe you are a baker and you are in connect you speak with other bakers in your town or your community, right? And professional means that you might work at the same job, right? So everyone who works in the same office or same department of a college, right, would be an example like he uses. Focal, right, is a community organized around a particular issue of concern, but not necessarily in a particular area. And then faux local sort of splits the difference, right? So again, it splits the difference in that you have a local component, right? So all of the members of a particular college department are located in the same location, but that their concerns are also shaped by broader conversations that are happening at the regional, national, and international level as a field of scholars. So what does it mean if we want to, let's say I want to use Swales instead of G for my project, right? Well, I probably have to think about whether this is a local, focal, or faux local community, or at least establish what framework I'm using for my analysis. So local might be your play group or your local game store. So I get together regularly with two different groups of individuals. There's some overlap. There's about 4 of us, 5 of us in one group, 6 of us in another. And currently we get together via Zoom, right? Because we can't get together in the same location. But presumably if we could, right, we'd all be getting together at someone's house or condo or whatever, right? But it could also be a local gaming store, right? Most stores have nights where you can just show up, drop in, and meet up with other players and get a game going. And that is a local community, right? That'd be a local sort of discourse community. So the major one in Southern Connecticut is Battlegrounds in Norwalk, but there are others. Heroes, Comics, and Cards are sort of two of the other ones that kind of come to mind. And they would form their own sort of discourse communities, right? They are local discourse communities with a fairly static set of players. That establish certain sort of expectations and forms of communication, right? We could also think about this game as a focal discourse community, right? Because it's played nationally, internationally. It's gotten a lot of attention. It's probably more popular now than it ever has been due to streaming. It also got some spotlight because of the Netflix series Stranger Things, which featured characters playing it. I've had more students ask me how to play the game in the past 2 years than probably in the past, the previous 8 before that, which I think is really interesting. And so there is something about the game that has sort of a broader appeal, and people communicate on message boards. People produce podcasts, video series that aren't designed for any one specific local community, right? They're directed towards a larger community organized by their interest in the game rather than any sort of local considerations. If I wanted to dive into the concept of what does faux local mean in this particular context, and I would argue that faux local does apply, we might look at the way in which a local group creates what we would call house rules, right? Specific rules just for that group that might deviate from standard rules as written. And I won't get into specific examples here, but there might be something, well, the rules of the game suggest that this is how you do X, Y, and Z, and you might decide as a group that that's not particularly fun, or your group doesn't think that makes sense, and so you change the rules. They might hold in your local community, but if you're stepping out into a broader community, you have to recognize that they don't necessarily mesh, and you have to adapt accordingly. So we think about, key discourse community features, right? Goals, intercommunication, participation, genres, Lexis expertise, hierarchy, or silential relations. We can think about them in terms of how they apply to this particular discourse community. And if I was working on this project, I would have to think about. I'd probably start by going through all of them and then determine which of them are most interesting to kind of talk about based on my research, my interviews, and my personal sort of what I'm interested in thinking about. So if I'm using Swales, right, and again, before I determine what I'm actually going to focus on in my project, I would probably run through his 8 criteria to try and understand what it is that makes sense about my discourse community and how it functions as a discourse community, right? Because presumably, if I'm trying to show how one demonstrates authority within a community, I have to understand what are the sort of the 8 major criteria that make something a community to begin with. Because presumably, again, to be a master of that community or to have authority within that community, you would have to presumably be able to demonstrate the ways in which you understand and can make use of the various texts that support these kinds of categories. So, he talks about goals, right? Goals is pretty broad, right? What's the group trying to accomplish, right? And Swales notes that not everyone in the group may be working towards the same goals, right? That they may have different ideas about what the group should try to accomplish. If I was looking at this, if I decided to do my project around the discourse community of Dungeons and Dragons, right? I would have to try and establish, well, what are the community's goals? And part of that might come through, like, how would I make that argument? Well, I might look at, the website for the company that makes the game, and maybe they sort of provide a statement about what the main goals of the community should be. I might look at some of the rules books and their introductions, which talk a little bit about the point of the game and why it matters. I might talk to someone who plays the game and interview them and get a sense of what they believe the goals of the community are. I might try to interpolate what the goals are, extrapolate what the goals are by looking at a discussion board, right? There's lots of ways you could do it. And so I might talk about how, depending on the person in the group, right, goal, the overall goal is to have a good experience. Now, what that means for different people might vary. So for some, it might mean playing the optimal version of their particular character and really mastering the rules of the game. For others, it's coming up with a really good character idea and sort of embodying that idea while they're playing. For others, it might be crafting a really good narrative. But these are all in service of one sort of larger goal, which is to have a good experience. And so we would think about how do the genres around this discourse community, or how do the texts around this discourse community facilitate that, right? That may be some, how does one demonstrate commitment to, for example, these goals through the way that they make use of these genres. Swales also identifies intercommunication as central to a discourse community, and I think at its core just means how do members communicate with one another. And he notes, right, as an example in the text, right, if you all of the people who subscribe to a particular magazine do not make a discourse community, because just because they're all reading the same magazine or the same newspaper does not mean that they're actually communicating with one another as a community. So for something to be a discourse community, there has to be some way for members to regularly communicate with one another. So how does that happen in this particular discourse community? Forums, right? Reddit is a popular way for people to communicate with one another in a local context. So if I was looking at this discourse community from a local perspective, texts, emails, my group uses the app Discord as a way to have voice chat and sort of group messaging. Shared cloud-based file systems, so frequently groups make use of either Google Drive or some other third-party applications that allow you to manage materials for your gaming group. Another key part for Swales is the idea that groups need to be able to, there has to be ways for members to participate and use language to participate in the decision-making of the group. So the local, again, if I want to look at what does it mean to demonstrate authority in the ways in which you participate, right, I have to examine what are the ways that you participate. So if I was looking at this from a local perspective, right, participation might mean having pre or post-game recaps with the other players to sort of determine, what worked in the last session, what are players enjoying, what are players not enjoying, how to adjust the game accordingly. That could take place in group chats. It might take place on group websites. So in the past, I've built websites to sort of host, these kinds of conversations for members of my playing group. At a focal level, right, I'm regularly asked to participate in surveys. We got a typo in there. Let's fix that. See, no one's perfect. Dun, dun, dun. There we go. There we are. Right, so I might participate in surveys from the company that say, tell us about your thoughts on this new product or, this new proposed rule change. I might participate in forums, right? I'm actually much less active in forums than I used to be because I don't like arguing with strangers over the internet. I'm too old for that now. I don't have the time. People also might be asked to play test, right? So play testing is where you get sort of a draft of a set of game rules and you might be asked to try them out with your own group and then provide feedback to the company. So there are lots of different ways at both the local and focal levels to participate in this particular kind of discourse community. And so again, gets you thinking at the level of what are the kinds of ways that you could participate in such a way to signal that you are an authority in this particular group. Now, again, you will decide what elements of this theory you would want to apply if you're using Swales, and maybe this is not the way you want to go, but it's worth thinking through what this means for each community so that you can begin to make informed decisions about what you want to focus the project on. Genres are important. We saw that in Mirabelli. We saw that in Feldman. They tell us something about the communities that we're looking at. So again, genres are just sort of the kinds of texts that, from Swales' perspective, help to either advance the broader goals of the community or help facilitate participation in the community. So for Dungeons and Dragons as a discourse community, handbooks, supplemental rules materials, character sheets like I discussed before. People write short fiction to kind of get a sense that you're creating a character for this game, so they might do a little bit of short fiction writing to describe kind of where their character comes from, what their personality is, key events that might have shaped their perspective. People produce podcasts. I'm a fan of the Adventure Zone, but there are a bunch out there. Videos and streams. Critical Role is particularly popular in terms of YouTube videos or streaming their gameplay. Articles, whether that's on the official company website that makes the game or articles that other people have written about the game. Discussion posts. So there are lots of different genres and means of communication for people to engage with one another, interact, share ideas, solicit feedback, and so we might think about how does one make use of these genres in such a way to demonstrate authority, right? What would it mean to be able to do that? And you might not focus on all of them, right, in your project, right? In the same way that Mirabelli focuses on one particular genre, or Feldman looks at like one or two key genres. You're not going to talk about every genre in your community if that's the direction you're going. You're going to pick the ones that most speak to some element of what it means to sort of develop and come into a sense of mastery or authority within a particular system. Not going to spend a lot of time on Lexis here. We talked about it a bit in terms of discourse because it is a feature of both theories, but again, it's just specialized terminology, jargon, or code. I can go into any gaming store and sit down at a table and demonstrate at least some base level of literacy because I won't have to ask what terms like initiative, saving throw, DC, BAB, MAD, SAD, advantage, disadvantage, mean in the context of the game, right? I've played enough, I know the rules well enough where I don't need to have those things explained to me. And in fact, another way in which I could demonstrate my authority, right, would be helping to guide a new player at the table through what that means. And this ties actually into the idea of expertise, right? That there's some sort of hierarchy grounded in expertise and responsibility. Swales talks about the way in which expertise and authority helps to facilitate entry into an advancement within a discourse community, right? So what would that mean for this discourse community? Well, knowledge of the game system, the ability to teach others how to play the game or guide them through the process of playing the game. what would establish that you have expertise? Well, history with the game. I've been playing it for, oh good lord, it's been like 20 years at this point, on and off. So I mean, history accrues experience. Um, there's also some hierarchy, right? Although it's a collaborative game, the person sort of who's in charge of putting the game together within a local group has a degree of authority over what occurs. So you might think about this in terms of how tiered decision making occurs. So like, let's say someone says, "Oh, hey, I've got a friend who's interested in playing." Right? They couldn't just simply bring that person to the table. They'd have to clear it with the group. They'd have to clear it with the person running the game to see if they would be comfortable with bringing in a new player. And so, I think this particular category would be important for this project, because if the goal is to say, how do you show that you have authority, or how do you cultivate a sense of authority, or how is it that one gets recognized as having authority within a group, you would need to understand how authority is sort of organized or structured within a particular group, right? How is it that you recognize someone as being more or less of an authority than another? And this is actually an area that sort of distinguishes Swales and G, because G really puts it in as a binary, right? You're either in the group or you're out of the group, but he doesn't really deal a whole lot with sort of gradations in terms of expertise, whereas Swales acknowledges that up front, that there are these different layers of authority that one accrues over time. The idea of silential relations is interesting. This idea that every discourse community has things that they can sort of skip over or shorthand because there's an assumption that everyone knows it. So in Dungeons and Dragons, the example would be there are certain kinds of actions that you might take in a game that happen so frequently that you don't have to describe them in great detail. Or to go back to the checkers example, if you've ever played checkers, you know that when you move your piece to your opponent's back row, it gets quote unquote kinged, right? You might not even have to say it. The other player would just know that that is what you do at that point of the game. Finally, I think this is interesting as well, right? The idea of discourse communities set what Swales calls a horizon of expectations, right? So what determines good versus less good work within a particular community? What's sort of the rhythm of that particular community, right? What is the way in which things get structured? How are roles and responsibilities divided out, right? So if I was looking at this within my discourse community, I would talk about the ways in which how do players establish what they want to get out of the game, right? Every player is different. Every individual is different. So how do you negotiate that players might have different things that they want to get out of a particular game? What counts as a satisfying narrative, right? Within, these are things that are really established at the local level, right? That within your group of players, right, you have to work collaboratively to determine what counts as a satisfying narrative, and if there's a disagreement, how you resolve that. In terms of rhythm, right, how often do we play? Who hosts the game? If you're doing it digitally, right, what software are we going to use? What applications are we going to use? Are we going to use Zoom? Are we going to use Skype? Are we going to use Google Meet? And I'm being a bit facetious here with like who brings the chips, but again, if you're playing in person, it's part of the culture of the discourse community that like if you're playing and someone's running the game, you should bring food, like it's just or beer, either or. It's just sort of good practice, right? Good social practice to demonstrate that you get the again, this sort of intersects a bit with G and doing right, but this marks you as someone who gets what's supposed to be happening within this community. Before we jump into this next slide, so let me back up because I think this is important. I want to reiterate this. The process that I've just gone through here, right, of breaking down the different ways in which these key ideas from different theories apply to something that I might look at for a project, is an example of sort of the pre-writing that I might do, or sort of the pre-research work that I might do. So in kind of going, again, I'm able to speak to this because I've experienced within the community, right? But if it was a community that I was less familiar with, right, I would certainly be doing more research. And it's important to do this research even if you are familiar with the community, because you might get a different perspective, right? So if you're talking about a discourse community around a particular sport or team that you were a part of in high school, right, you might have a sense of what it means to display authority, but your coach might have a different one. And so speaking to that coach or even other players, right, helps you figure out, well, how do we cultivate a shared sense of what authority or literacy means within this context? As you go through this process, right, again, I don't expect you to touch on every single thing. that you could talk about in the project. In the same way, like, I'm not going to touch on every single thing from the G article that we could discuss. Like, there's a lot of stuff we could talk about with G that we're just not going to get to because we don't have the time to do all of it. And even in it doesn't matter how long the class was. Like, you could talk about the content in the G article for weeks. Really, there's enough dense material in there to do that. So part of the challenge of the project is figuring out if the goal is to say, what does it mean to prove that you're an authority or that you have literacy in this discourse or this discourse community? There's probably lots of ways to do that. So how do you decide what's most interesting to talk about within the broader context of the things that you could be talking about? And so you sketch all that. Ideally, what you want to do is you want to sketch all that out as part of your sort of shitty first draft so that you can then begin to think critically about what is it that really is worth keeping in this project and what is it that probably can go. So let's start wrapping up. What are some of the common features, regardless of which theory you look at? Again, these are different theories, but they have some overlap, right? Participation in language shapes your role in the group, whether it's a matter of just belonging or not belonging, or literally the role that you play within a particular group and its rhythms, if we talk about in terms of Swales and discourse communities and expectations. But language matters in terms of participation and inclusion within a particular group. Markers of insider outsider status can be tied to language, right? So G is very explicit about all of that. Swales, it's a little bit more buried, but it's still there, right? You need to know the genres. You need to know the lexis. You need to know how you can use those to participate and communicate across distance. You need to know how to use language and genre in order to advance the goals of the group or demonstrate your commitment to the goals of that group, right? Regardless of how formal or informal the nature of that group happens to be. And in both theories, there are assumptions about values and beliefs within the communities. And again, G calls this out very explicitly. Swales sort of references it and notes that it is present, but it's not something that, at least in this particular article, he spends a lot of time talking about, but it is there, right? It's not completely absent from the conversation. And so all of these kinds of features could be brought into your paper, regardless of which theory you talk about. Now, where do they diverge? And they diverge in a number of places, but I'm just going to call out some of the more important ones where I think that they diverge, right? So for G, right, G's theory is a bit more abstract in a lot of ways, right? It's discourses can run the gamut from very, very large to very, very small. Discourses frequently overlap. So, for example, it's hard to understand the broader discourse of, so the discourse of education overlaps with the discourses around whiteness and the discourses around issues of class, right? It's hard to tease those out. And so there's often multiple discourses operating within a situation simultaneously. So the boundaries can be fuzzy, and it can be hard to observe some of the things that he's looking at, which isn't to say they aren't there, but it means that you have to think differently about how you begin to suss out where they're present. With Swales is a bit more concrete, right? The communities that Swales points to are ones that are more easily discernible as communities, right? You could look at a department in a college and say, yep, that's a community, or a church and say, yep, that's a community, or even if we think about the more focal kinds of communities, right? You can think about a hobby and say, I'm part of, Swales he does bird watching, right? And he talks about how he's part of both a local kind of group with bird watchers, but participates in the broader national discourse of people who are interested in bird watching, right? But there's still a discernible, identifiable community that you can look at. What Swales doesn't necessarily bring to the table is he does not spend as much attention to the non-linguistic factors that determine how one is invited to participate into a group or how one advances through sort of the stages of mastery within that group. And G does pay significantly more attention to that, at least in this framing of the theory. So if that is something you're not particularly interested in, then maybe G isn't the right call. But if it is, right, then Swales might not get you where you need to go. So that's what I mean by these theories aren't right or wrong. They just have different kinds of explanatory power, and they focus on different elements of the question. So you have to think hard about which of them makes most sense for what you're doing. But I don't think there's any wrong decisions, right? Like, you might get out of the project and say, I probably should have done G instead, or I should have done Swales instead, but you're still going to have a functioning project. Regardless, as we're wrapping this up, because this has been a very long video at this point, and I appreciate your patience, right? Language doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? You can't understand language unless you understand the broader context around language. Literacy and insider status, tied to belonging, are closely tied together, right? So demonstration of literacy and what it means to be an insider have a lot of overlap, right? And in many ways, at least for G, right, literacy means demonstrating that kind of insiderness through the way that you use language and the way that language reflects other kinds of elements of what it means to be part of that discourse. In both theories, right, there's this sense of that, and regardless of which discourse theory we're looking at here, literacy is subject to external recognition, right? If we aren't seen as having it, then we don't have it. It doesn't matter whether you think you're literate. If the other people in the community do not think that you are, or do not see you as an insider, then your literacy doesn't have that much value, right? It's not going to allow you to obtain the kinds of what G would call, again, the various kinds of goods that come along with participation in that community, right? Whether we're talking about a dominant discourse that has sort of goals or rewards such as money or power or influence, or whether it's a non-dominant discourse, like Dungeons and Dragons is definitely a non-dominant discourse. It does not, in most cases, lead to any sort of money, power, prestige, etc. But it does allow you to have a stronger sense of affinity with the people that you're playing with. If you're seen as an outsider, regardless of whether it's dominant or non-dominant, you lose access to those benefits. And similarly in Swales, right, your ability to function within the community really hinges on your ability to demonstrate the degree to which you belong through the various uses of language and genre that exist within that community. And so in both of these theories, right, the larger implication here, and again, this is simply building off of some of the implications of the literacy readings, how we are seen depends on more than pure language, right? That mastering language in a vacuum is a meaningless concept, right? You're always trying to master language within a particular context, and you're always making decisions about how you want to for lack of a better term, play into the expectations of that particular community or push back against them. And that even if you use the language correctly in quotes here, right, that there are a host of other sort of social factors that will determine the degree to which your use of that language is successful. So good luck on these projects. I hope this was helpful, and take care.